Good afternoon, shalom, and welcome to our author event on Coco at the Ritz. It's a marvelous book, and I'm looking forward to our author, Gioia Diliberto. Our author series is sponsored by the Contra Costa Jewish Community Center, Congregation B'nai Shalom, and the Jewish Book Council in partnership with Diablo Valley Hadassah. All our author events can be found at underonetent.org, the signature program of the Contra Costa Jewish Community Center. And a reminder, we love to have questions for our author, so use the chat function at the bottom of your screen and type in your questions, which we'll ask after her formal presentation. And now, Gioia Diliberto's bio. She has written biographies of many women, including Jane Addams, Hadley Hemingway, Diane von Furstenberg, and Brenda Fraser. She also has written the acclaimed novel, I Am Madam X, which is excellent and really got great reviews. Her books, which center on the lives of women, I'm sorry I'm reading, but I couldn't memorize her biography, has been translated into many languages, and Gioia has contributed to many newspapers and publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, she lived in Chicago for many years, the Smithsonian, and, which I really love, Vanity Fair. I always make sure to get a subscription. She teaches writing and has recently moved to one of my own old haunts, I should say, the state of Connecticut from Chicago. And now it is our pleasure to introduce the author of Coco at the Ritz. Gioia, it's yours.
Thank you, Riva. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here, even virtually. I wish I was there in person because it's already winter in Connecticut. Thank you, everybody, for zooming in. I have been obsessed with Coco Chanel for a long time, to the point where I've written not one, but two novels about her. The first one was published by Scribner about 15 years ago. It's called The Collection, and it was set in Chanel's atelier in 1919 after the First World War. And of course, my new book, Coco at the Ritz, is set during the Nazi occupation during the Second World War. To me, Chanel is one of the most fascinating characters of the early 20th century. Hers is a great rags to riches, or I should say rags to couture story. And some of you may know the outlines of it from having read a book about her. There are lots and lots of books about Chanel, or perhaps you've seen one of the many movies about her. But she came from a very poor, grim background. Her parents were unmarried peddlers. Her mother died when she was 12 after the death of the sixth child she gave birth to. And Chanel's father put her and her two sisters in a grim convent orphanage in the south of France and farmed her brothers out to work. And Chanel never saw her father again. And from this inauspicious beginning, she managed to wedge herself into the world of celebrity and artistic achievement and wealth in Paris. And she did it at a time when women had no status in French life. French women didn't even get the right to vote until July 1944, which was almost 25 years after we American women got the right to vote. My initial interest in Chanel was aesthetic. I love fashion. I've always loved fashion. And I was fascinated by how she revolutionized dress. She got women out of constraining corsets, which they've been wearing for 500 years, and those awful floor draping skirts that did nothing but collect dust, and clothes that were full of ruffles and furbelows, and those hats that were as big as catering trays and weighed as much as a toddler. And she put women into these sleek, streamlined, chic clothes that still define how most of us want to dress. And I was very interested in how this revolution in fashion that she was responsible for related to the revolution in the arts in general in Paris after World War I. So what Chanel was doing in fashion was related to what Hemingway was doing in writing and what Picasso was doing in painting, what Jean Cocteau was doing in film and on the stage, and what Stravinsky was doing in music. And of course, she knew all these people. She didn't know Hemingway very well, but she was very close to Jean Cocteau. She had an affair with Stravinsky. There's actually a book and a movie about that. And she worked with Picasso. She designed the costumes for a production of Antigone that Jean Cocteau did. Picasso did the sets. And she would have liked to have had an affair with Picasso, but Chanel was exactly the kind of strong, independent woman that Picasso avoided like the plague. So that was never going to happen. I was also very interested in the fact that, to me, Chanel symbolized the spirit of her era. And as a writer, I'm always looking for that kind of a subject. These people exist in every era who transcend the details of their own lives to stand for something larger. And Chanel is one of those people. To me, her story, the story that I tell in my book, symbolizes the treachery of France during World War II. She's a kind of anti-Marianne, the French symbol of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And her story also points out the connections between fashion and fascism. And Riva and Claire and I were talking a little bit about this before we started. And I don't want to make too much of this, but I do think there is a connection. And some of you may recall the very ugly incident a few years ago when the Dior designer John Galliano was caught on tape in a bar in Paris making these vile anti-Semitic remarks to a woman who it turned out was not even Jewish. So in fashion, as in fascism, you have these very strict, arbitrary hierarchies. Fashion is all about exclusion. And it's a very slippery slope when you start condemning somebody for not wearing the right dress or carrying the right handbag or wearing the right boots, which is what John Galliano was attacking this woman for, to vilifying them for their very flesh and questioning their right to exist. And, you know, I find the incident with Galliano particularly disturbing because it happened in Paris and it was reminiscent of the Nazi occupation and how the French treated French Jews. You know, if you look at fashion leaders like Coco Chanel and her successor at Chanel, Karl Lagerfeld, who was the chief designer for the brand until his own death a couple of years ago, they are these kind of larger than life, charismatic leaders, like fascist leaders. And I think that, you know, it's something that's worth pointing out, especially because of what happened in the world of high fashion in France during World War II and with this incident with John Galliano. It is now a crime in France to make a racial slur, and Galliano was fired immediately, and I think he was fined $8,000, and of course his career was ruined. Chanel was overheard making anti-Semitic remarks also before the war. She didn't make them publicly after, at least publicly after the war. And her behavior during World War II and this anti-Semitism that she expressed really only came to light in recent years after some documents were declassified in 2011. I first learned about her arrest and interrogation, which is the sort of inciting incident of my novel. When I was researching my first Chanel book, set in the aftermath of World War I, 15 years ago. And some of you may have heard about this too. One morning in August, some of her biographers say September, 2 soldiers from the French forces of the interior went to the Ritz Hotel, hauled Chanel out of her suite, stuffed her in a Jeep, and took her somewhere, and she was interrogated for a couple of hours. Now, these guys who arrested Chanel were the same guys who were going around France picking up women who had slept with Germans or who had just sometimes been rumored to have slept with Germans, and shaving their heads and beating them up and parading them through the streets so their neighbors could jeer at them, sometimes stripping them naked. And it was this very ugly episode that de Gaulle put an end to when he came back from his own exile and set up official courts to try collaborators. They were a loose band of resistance fighters and ex-soldiers and even private citizens who'd taken up arms in the wake of the liberation of Paris. And they didn't have any real authority, except they were doing this. And you could imagine how terrified Chanel must have been. So I was fascinated by this. They targeted her, of course, because of her relationship with a very handsome German man named Hans Gunther von Dinklage, who was known as Spots, who she had an affair with throughout the war. He was 13 years younger than she was. She was never long without a man. He was the available guy. He spoke perfect French. His mother had been English. He spoke perfect English as well. He didn't wear a uniform, and it was easy for her to fool herself that he wasn't really a Nazi. This incident of her arrest and interrogation, I thought, was the most fascinating moment in her fascinating life, and almost nothing was known about it. And that's because it was unofficial. There was no record, as there would have been in an official court case. Chanel never talked about it. She paid people who might have known something about it to shut up about it. She paid people to keep her out of their memoirs. Nobody ever came forward and said, oh yes, I was the guy that went to the Ritz and hauled Chanel away, or oh yes, I was one of the guys that interrogated her. So nothing was known. So I had great latitude as an historical novelist to write this story as I imagined it, and the only way to really get at the story was imaginatively. My first rule in writing historical fiction is to never contradict the known truth. So I only invent in the interstitials where we don't know what happened, and I base what I've invented on research so that it could have happened, it might have happened. And I did do a lot of research. I read all the books about Chanel, and I read the millions of books that are out there about the Paris occupation. What we do know is that at the start of the occupation, Chanel fled Paris with thousands of her fellow citizens, and she went to the country, to the home of her nephew, André Pilas, who she was very close to. He was the son of her sister, Julie, who had died, had committed suicide. Julie had had several very unhappy romances and relationships with men, including with André's father. She'd been abandoned by André's father, and she was with another man who also abandoned her after André's birth, and she killed herself. Chanel took charge of André. She educated him. When he came of age, she found him a place in the Chanel empire. She bought him a house for his wife and his 2 children. At the start of the war, he joined the army, and he was very quickly captured by the Germans. He was a prisoner of war, and he was suffering from tuberculosis. And Chanel was desperate to save him. So she didn't stay long in the country. She was bored in the country anyway. She went back to Paris to see what she could do about getting André released. She gets back to Paris. She goes to the Ritz, where she had a suite. She had an apartment above her boutique at 31 Rue Cambon, where she had a dining room and a living room, and she kept her clothes and she had an office, but she slept every night at the Ritz in this very beautiful grand suite. She gets there, she sees this gigantic Nazi flag hanging off of the front entrance. She goes in and they tell her that they have taken her suite and given it to some Germans. And if she wants to stay at the hotel, she's going to have to move from the desirable side that looks out on the Place Vendôme and go to the less desirable side that looks out on Rue Cambon, where they have put all of the French who want to stay. And so she agreed to that, and they gave her 2 rooms, which eventually she ended up keeping for the rest of her life. And some point after that, she encountered Spatz von Dinklage. She had no doubt met him before the war. He had lived in Paris most of his adult life as an embassy attaché and a propaganda officer, and he was part of her social world. She no doubt saw him often at parties and restaurant and theater openings, but now she meets him again and becomes romantically involved with him. He probably was a member of the Nazi Party. I would think he would have to have been a member of the Nazi Party. He worked for the Abwehr, which wasn't the SS, but of course the Abwehr was connected to the SS. However, his boss, Wilhelm Canaris, was famously anti-Hitler. And in fact, Wilhelm Canaris was executed, beheaded by Hitler for his role in the plot to assassinate Hitler in 1944. So it's unclear how committed Spatz was to Nazi ideology. We just really don't know anything about him. I think living with Spatz helped pave the way for Chanel to be comfortable during the war, but I think it was more weakness than wickedness that drove her into Spatz's arms. I think there are many things that were much worse that she did during the war, which I write about in my book. And in one of her most dishonorable moments, she tried to use the Nazi race laws to get full control of her perfume company from her Jewish partners, Pierre and Paul Wertheimer, whose grandsons still own the company. Back in 1924, when her fashion business was taking off like gangbusters, she got the idea of making a perfume that would express the modern abstract spirit of her fashion and would be a suitable adjunct to the fashion. What she cared about was the fashion. She never dreamed that Chanel No. 5, this perfume, was going to explode like a champagne bottle left out in the sun and become the enormous global success that it did become and that it still is. It is the most successful perfume in the world. In fact, every 30 seconds, somebody somewhere buys a bottle of Chanel No. 5. During the occupation, the Wertheimers were safe in New York. They escaped at the start of the war. And they had taken with them the formula for Chanel No. 5, and they also managed to smuggle out of France a good supply of jasmine extract, which is a key element of Chanel No. 5. And they were manufacturing Chanel No. 5 out of a facility in Hoboken, New Jersey, and they were selling it at PXs and drugstores, and Americans were buying it like crazy. It was a little piece of French luxury that most people could afford, and it was a reminder of the elegant life that might never return. The Wertheimers, before they left, also completely outsmarted Chanel by having their 80% share in the company. They owned 80%, she owned 10%, and another investor owned 10%. And she had tried to get she had sued them over the years to get to get the full control of the company, but nothing ever came of the lawsuits. And now, though, she thought, I'm going to go to the Gestapo and say, the company has been abandoned by its Jewish owners, and I, as a Christian French woman, should be allowed to have full control of it. But they had transferred their shares to a Christian Frenchman named Felix Amiot, who was making airplanes for the Luftwaffe, actually. And the quid pro quo was that Amiot would return the shares to the Wertheimers if the Allies won, and the Wertheimers would vouch for Amiot as a true patriot, as someone who had been forced to make planes for the Germans. So what you have here is the Jewish Wertheimers collaborating with the collaborator. So you can see nobody in this story comes out smelling like Chanel No. 5. It's very complicated and complex. In any case, because of this maneuver by the Wertheimers, completely outsmarting Chanel, she couldn't get the company back, and it drove her crazy. She stopped wearing Chanel No. 5, and she started bad-mouthing the perfume, and she stopped wearing it, and I don't know what happened to that person. And basically cutting off her nose to spite her face, because it was Chanel No. 5 that was making them all rich. But she also started manufacturing rival perfumes out of Switzerland, like Chanel No. 19, Chanel No. 3, Chanel No. 8, in violation of her contract with the Wertheimers. One of the things that I wanted to explore in my book was the ambiguity of wartime morality. As the French writer André Gide said, most people were not heroes of resistance or villains of collaboration. Most people were like old, torn, battered shoes floating through murky waters, just trying to stay alive. And I heard about Chanel going to the Gestapo to get her company back. And also when I heard about her failing to sign the petition that Jean Cocteau started that might have saved her friend, the Jewish surrealist poet Max Jacob, I was really angry, and I really hated her. I had a great vehicle to try and tell the truth about Chanel in this very dramatic story of her arrest and interrogation on charges of being a traitor. But the problem was, how do you write the truth about Chanel in a novel? And to do it effectively, you have to get into her head. And because I disliked her so much and was so appalled by her behavior, I didn't want to be in her head. And so the first thing I did was I wrote a play. The play is also called Coco at the Ritz. And the play had several staged readings at the Actors Studio in New York. It was part of the Festival of Plays at the Actors Studio, and the wonderful actress, Broadway actress, she's also been in movies and TV, Layla Robbins. You may remember her from Homeland. She played the Kabul bureau chief, CIA bureau chief in Homeland. She was Coco. She's very blonde, but you would never know it because she exuded brunette Coco Chanel. But the play never had a real production, and also it left me kind of unsatisfied. I really wanted to write more about this story that I thought was important and so interesting. So now I had to delve into Chanel's character. I had to try and get into her head in order to write the novel. And to do that, I had to find where I thought her motivations were. I had to try to explain her, not to excuse her behavior, but to explain her. Her anti-Semitism was real. It was reflexive, which again does not excuse it. It probably came from her childhood. She probably heard the nuns saying a lot of anti-Semitic things. And I don't believe that she believed in Nazi ideology. I don't actually believe that Spatz believed in Nazi ideology either. But again, it's not to excuse her behavior. And she did some really stupid things and awful things, denouncing her partners being one of them and not signing the petition for her friend being the second one. And, that was sort of evil behavior, and evil people need the passive cooperation of a lot of other people to not pay attention to what's going on in order for them to go ahead with their evil plans. And so I think her complicity in not standing up against evil was terrible. And I think that's one of the lessons of the novel that I want people to come away with, is the importance and necessity of standing against evil when you see it. In his 2011 book, Sleeping with the Enemy, a journalist named Hal Vaughan, who is no longer with us, revealed some previously classified documents that showed some of Coco Chanel's harebrained schemes during the war, including one that the Germans called Model Hut, which means fashion hat. And it involved Chanel going to Madrid, first going to Berlin and meeting with the German foreign minister, Walter Schellenberg, who was tried at Nuremberg, and getting his authorization to go to Madrid to talk to Churchill. She knew Churchill from her days dating the Duke of Westminster, who was the richest man of his day at the time. He was like the Elon Musk of his day. And he was a friend of Churchill's, and Chanel saw Churchill at hunting parties. There are pictures of them hunting together, and Churchill loved Chanel. He admired her success. He found her witty and intelligent, and continued to see her after she broke up with the Duke of Westminster. In fact, they had dinner together in Chanel's suite on Rue Cambon right before the Nazis came to power in Paris. So the plan was that Chanel was going to go to Madrid and talk to Churchill on his way back from Tehran to London. And she was going to convince him to settle the war, to talk. Churchill had said that he would never talk to Hitler, but Chanel was going to convince him to do it, supposedly. And then she was going to go down in history as not only the woman who revolutionized fashion, but the woman who stopped the war. I mean, it was crazy, and it was incredibly narcissistic of her to even think that this was a possibility. But in any case, that's what she did. And it looks really, really bad. A lot of people think, oh, she went to Germany to talk to Walter Schellenberg, and then she went to Madrid on a Nazi pass, but she wasn't trying to help Germany. She was trying to broker a peace that was going to be beneficial to France. To this day, Chanel's bio on the company website makes no mention of her activities during the war or her relationship with Spots. If you look at the timeline, there's a big gap in the years 1940 to 1944. And in all of the many promotional films that the Chanel company has done over the years with Hollywood production values and big stars like Nicole Kidman and Keira Knightley and Geraldine Chapman and Kristen Stewart, there's mention of Spots in only one of these films. They're like 11 minutes, 15 minutes long. And before the pandemic, they were often shown in movie theaters. And in this one movie, I think it's still on the Chanel website, you can probably see it. Kristen Stewart plays Chanel in a faux biopic. And there's a scene about the movie. It's sort of like a little movie within a movie in 11 minutes. She's talking, the Kristen Stewart character is talking to the actor who's playing the director. And she says of this faux biopic, are we going to put anything about Spots and the war in this little movie? And he says, no, we are only going to discuss the years of happiness and success. And that's kind of the Chanel company's attitude. In fact, right after the spring 2023 show a few months ago, there was a spokesman for Chanel who said, at Chanel, we prefer serenity over controversy. And that's been their plan all along is to just whitewash Chanel, the founder. After all, the multi-billion-dollar company relies on the sense of chic and elegance its products and fashion convey for women, and nobody knew better than Chanel herself that fashion was a form of escapism. As the legendary Vogue editor Diana Vreeland said, fashion is the best, the greatest escape from the banality of the world. Nobody knows why Chanel was released from custody of the FFI when some women weren't. There was another woman who was as famous as Chanel at the time, Arletty, so famous like Cher, she only needed one name. She was a very, very famous actress, and she had lived with a German during the war like Chanel, and she was arrested by these guys and she was put in prison. So why Chanel was released and Arletty not, nobody knows. I don't think Chanel herself knows. Some people think it was Winston Churchill who intervened on her behalf, but I don't think it was Churchill because it's August 1944, and I think Churchill has more important things on his mind than Coco Chanel. Other people think that it could have been Pierre Reverdy. He's also a character in my book. He was a poet and a sometime lover of Chanel's, and he was in the resistance. But the resistance was not an organized body of soldiers. There was no central location where they communicated. It would have been hard, I think, for Reverdy to have even known about Chanel's arrest, let alone getting a message to somebody to facilitate her release. In any case, she could have been just released because they decided they didn't have enough to hold her. Nobody really knows, but she was released and she fled to Switzerland. Spatz also managed to avoid arrest. He fled to Germany and then he escaped again into Switzerland, and he and Chanel lived together for about 10 years. They broke up amicably. He ended up on an island off the coast of Spain where he painted nudes. He was supported by Chanel by a trust that she had set up in Switzerland, and that was the money in that trust she also used to pay off people like Walter Schellenberg. She was called back once by the official courts to testify at the trial of this really sleazy collaborator, Baron von Vaufrelon, who's also a character in my book. And she lied and lied and lied. She said she didn't know him very well, though they'd met. She had gone to Madrid with him. She knew him very well. And the judge suspected that she was lying. And he said, I think we should bring Chanel back and talk to her again, but they never did. And so that was the end of it. Meanwhile, Chanel is in Switzerland manufacturing her rival perfumes, number 19, number 8, number 3, and bad-mouthing Chanel number 5. And Pierre Wertheimer, the war's over now, and Pierre Wertheimer hears about this and he can't have this. The sales of Chanel number 5 are beginning to flag for the first time ever. Whether it had something to do with what Chanel was saying or doing, who knows, but he was very worried about her talking trash on Chanel number 5. And also he was very worried that if she talked to the press, it might come out that she had lived with Spatz. Some people in France kind of suspected it anyway. They knew about it. They knew that she'd stayed at the Ritz, which was just a Nazi hive during the war. And he didn't want her talking to the press. He didn't want her bad-mouthing the company cash cow. So he went to Switzerland and he said, I'll give you whatever you want to stop this. I'll even manufacture the perfumes myself. And I think you can still actually buy Chanel number 19. And of course she wanted the world. She said, I want you to pay my taxes. I want you to pay my bills at the Ritz. But most of all, I want you to bankroll my going back to fashion. She had closed her house in 1939 on the eve of war because she said she didn't think anybody would be interested in high fashion during war, though she had kept her house open during the First World War. Maybe she did it out of revenge to her workers who had gone on strike in 1936, and she never forgave them for that. In any case, she had been closed for 14 years and she desperately missed creating. She was a creator at heart. and she really wanted to get back to it. So Pierre agreed to bankroll her return to fashion. And so in 1954, she presented her first collection in 14 years. It was the collection in which she showed what we all think of as the iconic Chanel item of clothing, the boule boucle suit. And the French panned it because even though they didn't know probably about her mission to Germany and Madrid, and they probably didn't know all the details of how she had behaved during the war, they had heard, no doubt, about spots, and they knew she lived at the Ritz, and they weren't going to forgive her. But in America, we didn't know anything about her personal life. And so we in America embraced the return of Chanel as the second coming of the fashion messiah. In recent years, though, her behavior has become better known. Since 2011, I think, and the release or the declassification of those documents is when really people started to learn about her behavior. And with the rise also of social media, there's been a vocal element of fashion influencers, Instagrammers, and TikTok people who are, really want to boycott Chanel and who think she ought to be canceled. I absolutely do not think she should be canceled. First of all, I make a distinction between the founder and the brand. And I think Chanel has to be given credit for her accomplishments. I wish the brand would not whitewash her. I wish they would acknowledge what she had done during the war, but I don't think she should be canceled. And I don't think the brand should be canceled. If you can afford Chanel and you want to wear it, it's fine with me. So you don't have to zoom out if you're wearing Chanel lipstick or Chanel perfume right now. I'm eager to take your questions, but before I do, I want to just read the last lines of my book, because to me, they symbolize the whole theme of the book, the whole point of it. After the liberation of Paris, Chanel put a sign in the window of her boutique offering to give away to American soldiers to show her solidarity with the Allies. And there are pictures online, you can see them, of American soldiers lined up outside Rue Cambon waiting to get their free bottle of Chanel No. 5. And this is the last lines of my book, the last scene. An American soldier, one of thousands, would return home with a bottle of Chanel No. 5 in his rucksack. He would give it to his mother, and whenever she wore the perfume, as she would every day for the rest of her life, replacing this bottle many times over the years, she would think of the miracle of her son's return. And this is how we forget, with each drop of golden scent, the golden scent of treasured life, the golden scent that masks the dishonor of the world. Thank you. I'd love to hear your questions. I hope you have some.
Did she have Jews working for her in her company?
I don't know, actually, if she had Jews working for her in her company. She had, her doctor was Jewish, one of her lawyers was Jewish, but I don't know about the women working in her company. I imagine some of them were Jewish.
And someone has written that some of the women who were humiliated and marched through the street with their head shaved actually may have been in the resistance and were only pretending during the war in order to get information from the Nazis. Do you know anything about that?
It's possible. It's very possible. There were certainly a lot of people after the war who claimed to be in the resistance who weren't. Everybody was in the resistance after the war. I suppose there were women who and we know that there have been documented cases of women who had affairs with Germans so that they could get information from them.
If there aren't any questions, I'll ask, what is your next book?
Oh, my next book is a nonfiction book, and it's about a group of women who warred over prohibition during the Jazz Age. And it's a book about how women used political power, or tried to use political power, in the aftermath of getting suffrage. So it's set right after suffrage, 1920, to the end of prohibition in 1933.
Do you want to say something about Madam X? It's an excellent book.
Oh, thank you. Madam X is a novel that I wrote about the woman who is the subject of John Singer Sargent's famous painting, Madam X, which is at the Met. I think it's still at the Met. So yeah, she was, I tend to write about these women who are very strong, problematic characters. The women in my new book also are, I mean, nobody slept with a Nazi, but they tend to be very strong women who are not always very sympathetic. And it's hard to write about people who are not sympathetic. You know, Chanel is, and that's, I think, why I resisted it for so long. And I had her voice in my head. Thank God I don't have her voice in my head anymore, but I had her voice, and I felt that I knew her, but it was a struggle trying to understand her and trying to create her as a heroine that that people would want to read about in spite of what she did. And I ended up, as I said, not feeling that she was evil. I don't think she believed in the Nazi ideology, as I said. I think she was above all an opportunist. And she was, if the Germans won, she was going to make sure that she held on to her company and her building and her suite at the Ritz, even though it was a smaller one than she had before the war. And she was going to make sure that her nephew got out of prisoner of war camp alive, which he did. And it's unknown if his release had anything to do with Chanel's efforts or with Spotz's interference. That's completely unknown. But he was released with a whole batch of French prisoners and went back to living with his family and working at Chanel. But she did nothing to help her friend Max Jacob, and neither did Picasso, who was Max Jacob's. I don't know if anybody knows about the poet Max Jacob, but he was a very well-known French surrealist poet, and part of that circle that involved Picasso and Cocteau and Stravinsky in Paris in starting in the 1910s. And Picasso didn't sign the petition. None of Max's friends did, except for Cocteau, really, and a few others. And, you know, to me, that's worse than Chanel's sleeping with Spots. Although you could make the argument, I suppose, that she was afraid to sign it, as Picasso was afraid to sign it, because, you know, the Nazis could have gone after them, arrested them for having done that. They were, you know, they arrested people for nothing. But I feel that was when I found out about that, I was really upset that she had not signed the petition. It seemed at the time to me like an easy thing to do, you know, to save her friend. And it might not have done any good. He might have been killed anyway. He died at Drancy, which was a holding place before being sent to Auschwitz. He was scheduled to go, but he was suffering from pneumonia and he died before they had a chance to deport him.
Someone asked about her last years.
Oh, well, her last years were very lonely and sad and unhealthy. And one point that I found, not exactly of sympathy, but I punish her in the novel by having her suffer at the end of her life, and in a way that is punishing her for her behavior during the war. And I think it's true. I think it's based, I get that from what I know about her. She was alone. She was a morphine addict. She was still going to work, but she was very unhappy and very ill. And so I feel that her morphine addiction also, which had started before that, it started during the war, before the Second World War, actually. I think that she felt real guilt. I think that people who do bad things often do feel guilty and suffer for what they have done. And at least that's how I see her. I see her as somebody who suffered and ended her life not in a good way.
We don't have any more questions, but people wrote in that your talk was fascinating. Just to talk about, since we're talking about France, the film festival will feature 5 French films, a film called Haute Couture, and we hope that Gioia will join us to talk about the high fashion. We're showing Valiant Hearts, which takes place during the war. It's based on a true story of children, around 6 of them, who were able to hide in a chalet where a lot of the art from the Louvre were hidden from the Nazis, who were on the lookout for art that they could bring back to Germany, or some generals or Nazi leaders' own art collection. And they succeeded miraculously. We're showing Paris Boutique, which is actually a romantic comedy with a French leading star, but set in Jerusalem. The Accusation, which is a French legal trial about #MeToo. And also Farewell, Mr. Hoffman, which is a French Jewish jeweler who hides in his employee's shop, and what happens to their character development as someone who always worked for a Jewish employer, wasn't as close as the Nazis came to Paris, and he sort of changed sides. So a lot of French films starting February 25th through March 2nd. Again, we hope to have you back sometime for your next book. Gioia, it's been fascinating, and thank you. Everyone should, it's a great book for whatever holiday you're going to be celebrating this December, whether it's Kwanzaa, Christmas, New Year's, or of course, Hanukkah. I love the addition to a synagogue library. We have several independent bookstores. There's Rakestraw in Danville, Flashlight Book in Walnut Creek, Orinda Books in, well, Orinda. And of course, we do have a new Barnes & Noble in downtown. It disappeared for a while and is now back. So wherever you shop, think of Coco at the Ritz. Everyone, happy Thanksgiving, be well, and we'll see you at a future event. Thank you, Gioia.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving. And if you have more questions, or I didn't think I read everything in the chat, you can go to my website. My email address is there, and please email me. I'm always love questions, and I'd be happy to talk to you or answer your emails. Thank you, and happy Thanksgiving.
To everyone, goodbye, and be safe and healthy.
Bye.
Ciao.
Ciao.